thanks a lot for the kind introduction, and thanks a lot for having me. Very timely event, I think. I try to share a PowerPoint presentation here. You see it?
Yes.
Very good. So basically, I want to talk a bit about the impact of populism on EuroMediterranean Corporation 25 years after the Barcelona process, a process that started in 1995. So the 25th anniversary was during the pandemic, and we took that anniversary as an occasion to think a bit, okay, what's the status of the process, by what is it impacted? And actually the status is not that good, right? There was not that much to celebrate, so to speak. The Union for the Mediterranean actually tried to push it a bit, also with a hashtag on Twitter, but it hasn't really caught on, right? The high time of the Barcelona process was in a way at its beginning, and already 10 years after, it had lost already a bit of steam. And we kind of tried to shed light on the hows and whys by using populism as a kind of frame or angle to look at its impact on Mediterranean cooperation, especially over the past decade or so. During the presentation, so basically what I want to do is to look at the impact of populism on foreign policy, of Europe most notably, because most of the time populism, for good reasons, is more analyzed in terms of its economic impact or its impact on domestic policy. So I want to start with an outline of, hey, what is Mediterranean cooperation exactly? What is its history over the past 25 years exactly? And then afterwards, how the impact of populism was. Here you see the kind of beautiful picture of Mediterranean cooperation. We share one geographical room, the space, the Mediterranean. We even have a Mediterranean diet since the 1970s, and it shows you already. This is a very northern expression, the Mediterranean diet, kind of lifestyle term invented in the 1970s. As a Lebanese friend once told me, we don't call it Mediterranean diet, we call it Lebanese cuisine. So even a very innocent term like Mediterranean diet actually points to the very charged nature of the term Mediterranean, right? It's a northern term. Essentially, it's the Roman lake. It's even reverberates in the ideology of Mediterraneanism that informed Mussolini, but also French colonial politicians. So the European Union could be a bit more aware of the kind of baggage that comes with it. And sometimes European politicians, especially in Italy and France, one only needs to think about the notorious speech in Dakar of Sarkozy, where he really spoke like a colonist almost. They could be more aware of it. Having said that, the 1990s were a kind of pinnacle of Mediterranean cooperation. There was a lot of optimism. There was the Oslo Process. There was movement in the Arab-Israeli conflict or Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And the Europeans, for the first time, formulated a kind of goal of having more foreign policy coordination with the common foreign cooperation. There was a lot of optimism. The Oslo Process. There was movement in the Arab-Israeli conflict. You hear me? Yeah. Okay. There was some recording also. So that was the Barcelona process. That kind of lost steam only 10 years later with the second Intifada. The Arab heads of state didn't show up for the 10th anniversary. And it lost quite some steam. And most importantly, also then in 2003, there was great disunity on part of the Europeans regarding the Iraq War, this kind of famous dictum of Rumsfeld of old and new Europe, with France and Germany especially being against the Iraq War, while other countries like in Eastern Europe, but also, of course, the UK and Spain and Italy joined the US. So in that sense, the kind of policy had a question mark behind it, but at the same time, there were further efforts with the European neighborhood policy launched in 2004 that had a more bilateral kind of privileged bilateralism, that it had privileged relationships between the European Union and some countries that were regarded as good pupils, for example, Morocco, Tunisia, Jordan, in terms of economic policies, while bad students like Algeria, the kind of relationship was more subdued, not to mention a rogue state or almost rogue state at that time, like Libya, had been brought in from the cold after 2003. So that was the European neighborhood policy, so different from this more multilateral region building of the initial Barcelona process. Another landmark was the establishment of the Union of the Mediterranean in Barcelona, which still to this day functions also as a vehicle of, for example, projects between European states and countries of the region. But the whole launch of that also showed us that, well, from this pinnacle of European Mediterranean policy in the 1990s, there was an increased renationalization of policies. Later on, the very foundation of the Union for the Mediterranean was initially conceptualized by Sarkozy, essentially as an organization only of the Mediterranean riparians under French leadership, of course. And then Ms. Merkel, but also some other in the EU and some other European states said, no, we have to make it a European initiative. And that's why you see that rather un-Mediterranean countries like Sweden or Finland are nowadays part of the Union for the Mediterranean. So what we have kind of at the end of the 2000s, that we have really increased institutionalization. So this famous quote by Kissinger, who do I call if I want to call Europe? Well, now he has a number, yeah, maybe with 3 extensions, right? The Commission, the Council, and the High Representative, but still there is increased institutionalization, but at the same time, actually considerably less consensus among the powers that be, among various European countries, and arguably as a result, less momentum in a Mediterranean policy than in the 1990s, where optimism was abound and where we had quite some progress, for example, in the Arab-Israeli question and with Oslo and so on. Now, what is the impact of populism here? First, let me clarify a couple of points or definitions after the discussions that we had during the last session. First, I think populists are still on the democratic spectrum, right? They participate in elections. They want to win the elections, and they crave for victories in elections. They crave for some sort of democratic legitimacy. Just think about Donald Trump. He's not authoritarian in the sense that, well, he has authoritarian tendencies, but at the same time, he really has craved this kind of attention, and he wanted, so populism can only happen against some sort of democratic backdrop. They are not authoritarians. So in the previous presentation, there was, for example, Mussolini figured as a populist. Mussolini was not a populist. He was an authoritarian, a fascist, but there are very considerable differences here. Also, the economic definition that was applied, for example, to Latin American populism in the 60s is too narrow. Yeah, this kind of reckless spending that is fiscally unsustainable for political expediency. Well, it has happened, but this view has excluded exclusionary right-wing populism, which is today rather dominant in Europe. So that's why those the ideational approach that has also been discussed prominently during the last session by Mudde and others really highlights this kind of pan-ideological spectrum from left to right, this differentiation between pure people and corrupt elites, anti-pluralistic, and borrowing from thick ideology. So overall, it's a thin ideology that's very malleable. Having said that, there are also other definitions and competing definitions at times. Most notably, I want to highlight here the political strategy approach, that kind of where the ideational approach focuses on what populists say. The political strategy approach actually looks, what are they actually doing? Yeah, this unmediated, often leader-centric appeal by to an unorganized mass of followers with weak formal organization. So very different from Mussolini, right, where ideology plays a big role, where you have a very strong formal organization, where also ideological purity is considered very important, and where democracy and winning elections is not that important because you know the truth, right, and you're pushing for the new man, and everybody who is against that has to get out of the way. Also the social cultural approach, but that I want to leave aside here just for completeness. So what I want to say is populism can mean different things to different people, and I think beside what populists say, we also will need to take a look a bit, what do they actually do, how do they organize? I think it's also an important aspect. And also it came up during the last session, there's not just left and right-wing populism, there's also the market liberal populism variety of Berlusconi, for example, which is quite different from the right-wing populism of Salvini. Also the Latin American populists of the 90s came up. And then we also have regional populisms, the Lega Nord, because before it turned into a pan-Italian enterprise, basically a change that was sponsored by Salvini, or some Catalonian separatists in Spain that more recently also framed this whole territorial conflict in very populist terms, right here, the pure Catalonian people against the corrupt elites in Madrid, which also had, of course, an impact on Mediterranean Corporation in the very city that gave the Barcelona process its name. So what kind of impact can we see? Well, it's mostly from right-wing populism. Here, of course, migration has been a major stumbling stone, especially Eastern European countries, opposing very much a quota system that was proposed by Ms. Merkel, but also in Denmark here on the right-hand side. But that goes much further, especially Viktor Orban has become a kind of bugbear of the European Union, really actively torpedoing a more unified stance, and also kind of damaging the core brand of the European Union as a kind of model of democratic cooperation. So it was very difficult for the European Union recently to push forward initiatives, for example, regarding human rights or NGOs, not just in the Mediterranean, for example, in Egypt or in Turkey, but also in Hong Kong, yeah, where essentially Orban openly sided with adversaries. Also in case of Libya, for example, we had certainly an impact from the populist side when Italy and France clashed. Of course, there are national interests involved in the oil sector, and essentially both ended up supporting opposing sides in the Libyan civil war. Italy, the government in Tripoli, and France, the Haftar, the warlord in the eastern part of the country. So at one point, France even withdrew his ambassador, and Salvini accused France of exploiting Africa in a colonial fashion. Yeah. So you can see this kind of personalistic approach of populism can exacerbate existing tensions that are rooted in diverging national interests, and the diplomacy-making bureaucracy can be slightly emasculated. Yeah? But by the way, if we take a look from the political strategic point of view of populism, Macron actually has borrowed some of the playbook of populism, right? It's a very leader-centric movement. It's a EM, yeah, even using the two letters of his name and surname. It has very much opposed, or has run against the old parties and the party establishment, and of course shows essentially that populism is not just the kind of bad guy in the room, but also kind of indicator of underlying crises of democratic institutions. Yeah. It doesn't. Now it goes. Yeah, and sometimes the European Union is also on the receiving side of populism. In the MENA region, mostly governed authoritarian populism is not that widespread. Having said that, those countries that have some sort of democratic institutions have seen, also have been analyzed through the populism prism, most notably Turkey, Israel under Netanyahu, but also in Tunisia. Although Tunisia now with Kais Saied, we can arguably speak of almost a return to some sort of authoritarianism to zero. Worthwhile looking ahead is to look at the EU agenda for the Mediterranean of 2021. And you can see here the 5 major points really touch up on areas where populism has had some influence in European Mediterranean policy. And it also shows in the document itself where it really tries to lowball this issue of migration, and the wording that the document chooses really essentially tries not to stir too much disagreement from the Eastern European side. Peace and security as well. The Palestinians are not even mentioned, so it's very much rather on the kind of this whole peace process has kind of ended up on the back burner. And of course, the exclusionary right, although people like Viktor Orban are essentially using anti-Semitic propaganda for domestic audiences in Hungary, he has had very close relationships actually with Israel under Netanyahu, and within a kind of clash of civilization narrative, various populists in Europe have rather sided with Israel as a kind of forward bastion of Western civilization, as some construction of a monolithic Islamic enemy. Also, you can see with resilience, a new mantra of the European Union, it kind of has downgraded its earlier discourse on export of democracy and so on. Resilience, a much more malleable, technocratic notion that can go together actually with more authoritarian forms of governments as well. So to conclude, what has been the influence of populism on Mediterranean cooperation? Essentially, there have been 3 avenues of influence. Sometimes populists have been in power, most notably Eastern Europe, but also in Italy with Salvini as Minister of Foreign Affairs. Even when they haven't been in power, they have had considerable influence in terms of agenda setting. We see it very much in France, where Macron is under a lot of pressure and seems to have adopted some of the populist agendas, or at least the rhetoric. And in some cases, it has led to disturbed interinstitutional cooperation between local levels of or regional levels of government and central levels of government. That is the case of Spain and the Catalonian conflict that has led to a kind of more inward-looking perspective of a former champion of Mediterranean cooperation, and of course has also led to the rise of has contributed to the rise of right-wing populism in Spain, which was for a long time kind of immune, but now Vox is firmly established, and actually Vox in Spain grew not so much because of the migration issue. It was really the Catalonian territorial conflict. So you can see that different populisms also can feed each other. Secondly, the borrowed thick ideologies from which the thin ideology of populism borrows matter. Yeah, we see that with the exclusionary right-wing populisms in issues of migration. They very much focus on Turkey for kind of clash of civilization motivations. And we see it with Salvini, right? Berlusconi, market liberal populism was still for Turkey EU ascension. Salvini now very much has Turkey in his, or had Turkey in his sights. So Turkey is kind of one topic they are dealing very much with. Also Israel-Palestinian conflict. Some of them have mulled to move their embassy to Jerusalem from Tel Aviv, like the USA has done under Trump, and this whole issue of NGOs and human rights, where rulers like Orban very much agree with authoritarians in the Middle East that NGOs shouldn't have too much room to maneuver. Having said that, inclusionary left-wing populism like Podemos in Spain, they have, of course, less votes, are also less focused on the Mediterranean. When they do, they also hold dedicated, often then opposing views. In the case of Podemos, it has sided quite openly with the BDS movement. Otherwise, populists are mostly anti-interventionists on principle on the left, more selectively on the right. Having said that, a lot of the right-wing populists have actually sided or endorsed Russia's Syria intervention, which might have something to do that they received quite some money from them. I mean, at least the Front National or the earlier Front National in France, but even Salvini was in one point in talks with the Russians to get money. Of course, that is a serious question of credibility in Europe as well, and arguably stability as well. Having said that, national interests and the weight of institutions mediate the impact of populism. Of course, there is some sort of pre-existing national interest that exists regardless of populism. You have bureaucracies that kind of have something else in mind than just migration all the time, right? However, we have seen that the personalization of power can lead to this relative emasculation of the diplomacy-making bureaucracy, certainly in places like Turkey, for example, and that it can exacerbate existing tensions, as we have seen, for example, in the case of this spat between France and Italy over Libya. That's from my side, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very granular view of the state in the EU-Mediterranean context, if I use that word Mediterranean as well. And we now have the chance to ask questions for a couple of minutes. Please use the hand raise function. Or there is, Hercules Milas, yeah, you want to ask a question, please. Please unmute.
Okay, now you hear my...
Yes.
Okay. Professor Woertz, I thank you very much. I listened to you with great interest because I am from the Mediterranean, so I have the special interest in what you said. Thank you very much. My question is about different appearances of populism. We have right-wing populism, left-wing populism, territorial, economic, and so forth. Now, I understand the differences, but we have to have, I think, common characteristics that justifies that all those different populisms are classified under the general title of populism. What is the general characteristic so that we call them all populism, even though there are differences between them?
Well, I mean, this basically goes back to these different, these various approaches. The ideational approach saying it's this, this kind of dichotomy of the pure people versus the corrupt elites, the appeal to an imagined general will, and an opposition to pluralistic ways of resolving conflicts. The strategic approach focuses more on the kind of organizational characteristics of populist movements, which are quite different from authoritarianism, as I've pointed out, and happen against the backdrop of democratic procedures. You point to a very important issue, right? That populism can mean different things to different people, and that is a pretty broad-based concept. And some people might even argue too broad to be of analytical value. Having said that, there is arguably increased use of such measures, be it on the ideational level or on the political strategic level over the past decade, especially in Europe, but also in other parts of the world. Think of Bolsonaro, think of Trump, think of Modi, and so on. All people who come from different ideological persuasions at times.
Thank you.
Well, I don't see any hand raised. So actually, I have a question of my own. When you speak of the cooperation EU-Mediterranean, you touch on transnational issues. And I wonder whether one can say something more systematic, or whether you would propose something more systematic on other transnational relationships, like populism in one region leads to more populism in the same region, or the democratic non-populist state reinforce each other. So could you say something on the transnational aspects?
Well, in some cases, they certainly reinforce each other. You could argue that the Turkish populism essentially moves away from the EU after the EU itself has more or less rejected Turkey at the end of the 2000s. Turkey increasingly develops this policy of neo-Ottomanism, looking to Central Asia and looking to the Middle East, but also position itself more vocally against the kind of soft power agenda of the EU. So in that case, and of course, on the other hand, the populists in Europe, have set their eye very much on Turkey as a kind of Muslim regional power. So that is certainly one aspect. And then you have some sort of cooperation or attempts at cooperation between populists. At one point, Salvini reaches out to the Eastern European populists. Having said that, there are very national movements, so the potential for disagreement between populists is very high. Yeah? So I would rather see here potential for populists to disagree when push comes to shove, than to build some sort of alliance.
Yeah, thank you. I understand. Yes, I see two more hands raised. First by Ibrahim Ostür. Unmute, please.
My question concerns the use of two crucially important terms mostly used by academicians, including you in your presentation. One term is resilience, the other one is connectivity. Up to my information, the term resilience concerns more on security, but the term connectivity puts very much emphasis on the need of further globalization. How would populist perspective would create impact in the reconciliation of those two mutually exclusive concepts?
You would say resilience and connectivity are mutually exclusive?
Somehow, yes.
Why?
Further connectivity maybe, according to some authors, experts, might undermine the security concerns, autonomy, search of autonomy, or maybe independence of countries somehow.
Well, I mean, resilience is not just about hard security or so, right? It's again a quite broad-based term. It can relate to climate change adaptation. It can relate to the resilience of political institutions. It can relate to resilience of civil society that prevents conflicts and so on. To be honest, I've put it there because the EU has very much put it on its agenda. It has entered the European vocabulary, and I suspect it is because the European Union itself, right, has now or sees itself more like a realist actor, right? It needs to learn the language of power, like Mr. Borrell has said, and Ms. von der Leyen has said it should be a more geopolitical union. So you need to cut deals, right? And you need to kind of dial down your democratic proselyte. Anyway, you know what I mean. Your agenda of democratization, if it ever existed to that extent, yeah, beyond rhetoric. I would say there was something, or there is still something to it, more than just rhetoric, but clearly the European Union is much more realist in its rhetoric, and you see it now with the whole policy towards Southern Mediterranean autocrats. Basically they have made their peace with Sisi. You don't see a lot of protests against the human rights situation in Egypt, and also what Kais Saied is doing right now in Tunisia. I sense the European Union is back to its old ways, that it essentially cuts deals with the authoritarians of this region, and this whole democratization hope of the Arab Spring is kind of fading away a bit.
Okay, we are already a little bit beyond time. Aline Boni, is it okay to do it maybe in the chat bilaterally, or maybe also open to all, and Eckart Woertz will answer in the chat? Is that okay?
Yeah, of course.
Thank you for your understanding. Well, thank you very much. This was the first part. Thanks to the very interesting presentation and also to the questions.